When George found strange eggs behind his barn, he found himself riddled with fear, wondering what strange animal must have laid them. But because of a blistering snowstorm, he could not bring himself to leave them out there to die. So he took them in and warmed them till they hatched. What broke through those shiny shells changed his life forever. George was a hard worker and a dedicated farmer, but despite his best efforts, his fields struggled badly. He owned a barn of horses and cows and chickens, some of which were stray animals he had taken in and given a home. He also had 3 fields where he planted grain. He would rise before dawn to feed his animals even before he had breakfast. Then he would begin work on the farm till late at night. But the weather had been horrible the past few years. Sometimes there would be terrible storms, and sometimes there would be blistering heat, and both killed plants and even animals. What was more, pests like termites and beetles attacked the fields too from time to time. In fact, many farms around him had given up and shut down. But George couldn't. It was very hard, but he continued on because of the animals. If he closed down the farm, they would have nowhere to go. But finally the worst had happened. He had run out of money. He could no longer afford to feed the animals, and the farm could not survive any longer. He knew he had to sell the farm, and was hoping he would find a buyer who would agree to take in the animals too. But the day before he finally spoke to his lawyer, he found the strangest eggs he had ever seen behind his barn. It all began with a blistering storm. The storm came down with a vengeance, tore through his fields, and even crashed his wooden fence. George had grabbed his coat and walked into the storm, down to the barn, to check on his animals. He didn't mind getting hurt. He wanted to be sure his animals were okay. But as he neared the back of the barn, his expert eyes caught something strange lying near the barn's back door. At first, it looked like nothing more than a pile of snow, but then a faint glint caught his eye. What do you think it was? He stopped in his tracks, curiosity coursing through his veins. He looked about him, and seeing no one, he dropped to his knees and squinted closely at the slight shimmer. He still could not understand what he was seeing, so he began to dig. He dug into the pile of snow, even as the storm became worse, and at last he unearthed what was hidden. What he saw made him gasp. It was a cluster of huge eggs, 5, to be exact. But these were not ordinary farm eggs. How do you think they looked? These eggs were the largest eggs he had ever seen. Their shells were as blue as the ocean, and they also had a silver pattern that shimmered even in the dim light. George had never seen anything like it. He definitely had never seen an egg shimmer, had you? But their shimmer was not the only weird thing about them. These eggs also radiated a chill that seemed unnatural, even in the frigid storm. George couldn't understand what he was feeling, so a strong sense of unease began to creep into him. Where did these eggs come from, he wondered. He had never seen or felt anything like it. No bird or animal he knew could lay something as large as this, especially not in the dead of winter. He looked about him again, but only the howling wind answered the questions in his mind. This was such a weird discovery, and a part of him wanted to leave them lying in the storm. But when he looked down at them, a pang of sympathy flickered through him. George had dealt with enough eggs to know that they would not survive the storm. So he brushed the snow off the shells and tried to pick them up. But just as he did, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. George jerked in surprise. What do you think just happened? George couldn't tell what had happened, but warning bells began ringing in his head. Again, he considered jumping to his feet and abandoning the eggs in the storm. What would you have done in George's shoes? Share your thoughts below. Well, George still decided to take them in. What was the worst that could happen, he wondered. Besides, he had to close his farm soon. At least he would save one last animal before it closed. He took a deep breath and carefully gathered the eggs into his coat with delicate care. Then he straightened up and trudged back to his home. Even with the blistering snow and the terrible wind, he trudged slowly, holding the eggs firmly, until he arrived at the main house. He was shivering so terribly he even dropped the match 4 times when he tried to start a fire. But at last he managed to get a fire going. He arranged the eggs beside the fire, then crawled to his room to shrug off his drenched clothes for fresh and heavier ones. On a different day, he would have heated up the hot tub and soaked himself in, but that night he returned to the fire and laid down beside the eggs so he could keep an eye on them. The next morning, George kept the fire going for the eggs, while he trudged out into the storm again to feed his animals. He was always quite kind to animals. Maybe it was a pity for something helpless, something that had no chance of survival. Whatever the reason, he cared well for everything under his care. But he was running out of feed for the animals and was now having to improvise a lot. But that did not stop him. He still cared for them and the eggs. He made sure the eggs stayed by the fire, and for days he did everything he could to keep them warm. He even rotated them gently, as he had seen his hens do. Every evening he talked to them as he went about his chores. He told them about the other animals and about how he would have to let the farm go. He had postponed the call to his lawyer until the eggs hatched. On the third day, though, he found himself wondering if the eggs would ever hatch. He wondered if they had died before he found them in the storm. Do you think the eggs will ever hatch? What do you think the eggs will do instead? 2 more days passed and nothing happened. He checked on the eggs every morning and even regulated the heat to keep the rays from harming them. But still, nothing happened. Well, on the 7th morning, just as the storm finally stopped and dawn painted the blue skies with golden rays, the strangest thing occurred. George had been asleep by the eggs when he heard a loud tapping sound. He shot up in surprise and rubbed his heavy eyes. As a farmer, he was always alert, even in his sleep. He traced the tapping sound to the eggs and jumped up with fright when he noticed one of the eggs was hatching. What came out from those strong blue shells was like nothing he had ever seen before. George was transfixed to a spot for several minutes, his jaw hanging open. What do you think lay in those strange eggs? It took just a few minutes for all 5 eggs to hatch, and in those few minutes George could neither speak nor move. His feet became quite cold, and his heart began racing. These were no ordinary birds. Their bellies shimmered and even reflected light like the scales of a fish. Their large eyes glittered too, and they even looked sentient. Their feathers were filled with iridescent hues of green, blue, and gold. And when they opened their beaks, it wasn't chirping that rang out. It was a soft melody that resonated in George's chest. In fact, George couldn't believe his ears as the bird songs harmonized with each other and created a hauntingly beautiful tune. George didn't know whether to be awed or terrified. They seemed to come from a different planet. He sat, stunned, for almost an hour as they walked around the basket and fluttered their iridescent, tiny wings. At last, he managed to shake himself and jumped up to grab a mixture of grain and mashed fruit to feed them. But the second he dropped the plates, they tore down the meal and pecked up every tiny drop. George watched them with even more awe. They had such voracious appetites, and he wondered if he would be able to feed them well. But to add to their already long list of surprises, they even seemed to grow bigger before his eyes. Over the next week, they grew even more quickly. Their feathers became prettier and more beautiful, and they even began to mimic sounds around them. In fact, they mimicked everything: the crackle of the fire, the creak of the floorboards, even snippets of George's own voice. Every morning George awoke to new surprises. But one fateful morning he noticed something else. In just a few days after the blistering storm, his field had begun to produce fruits. That was the strangest thing ever. How was that even possible? Do you think that is possible? What do you think will happen next? This is what happened next. George got a visitor. This visitor arrived a week after the eggs had hatched, when the snow had melted enough to clear the road and allow George to sell the strange new fruits from his farm. Who do you think this visitor was? His visitor was Maggie, his neighbor. Maggie arrived carrying a casserole dish and her usual nosy curiosity. She had heard about his healthy fruits and was quite curious as to where he got them. When she walked into his farm, she was shocked to see his fields were already yielding fruits. George did not want to let her in, but he hadn't seen another soul in weeks, and he was tired of only talking to the birds. "Oh, my stars," Maggie gasped when she stepped into the main house and saw the birds. "What are those?" "I found their eggs during the storm," George tried to explain. "Thought they wouldn't survive, but they did." "They're beautiful," she whispered, stepping closer, and the birds tilted their heads in unison at her, their bright eyes fixed on her. "Wow, I've never seen anything like them. What kind are they?" "I don't know," George admitted. Maggie looked out a window at the fields, and then down at the birds again. "Wait, is this why your fields are yielding fruits even after that terrible storm?" George did not know what to say to that, so he stayed silent. He tried to lead her away, but Maggie did not seem to want to leave. She seemed so intrigued she kept staring at them. At last, George told her to stay for tea. But even at tea she could speak of nothing else. By the time she left, he was certain she would tell everyone in town, and he wasn't wrong. The next day more visitors arrived at his newly erected fence. Word had spread indeed, and soon his farm became a local museum. They showed up uninvited, gasped at his fields, and marveled at the birds. But they did something else. They bought many of his fruits. George was very happy. He now had money to buy more food for the other animals. The villagers seemed quite curious about the strange birds. But not everyone was curious in the same way. In fact, someone was very angry. Who do you think it was? And why do you think this person was angry? Well, one night, George found a note nailed to his barn door. "Those birds don't belong here. Send them back where they came from." The note was not signed, but George did not need a signature to know who had written it. Hank Peterson had always been the kind to fear what he did not understand. But George was not afraid of anything or anyone. In fact, he even confronted Hank when he saw him at the general store, and Hank did not deny it. "Those birds of yours are trouble waiting to happen," Hank had said with a gruff voice. "Mark my words, George, you'll regret keeping them around." George did not argue. He knew fear often masked itself as hostility, so he nodded and walked away. But he kept his birds, and so his fields became better and better. Soon, George realized that he might not have to sell his farm anymore. He could keep his animals and the farm. He was so happy and so grateful to the birds because he knew it was them helping the farm. The other animals were becoming healthy too, and they moved around happily. But Hank's words never left George's mind, especially as the birds changed even more. They were becoming more active, and their behaviors were even more peculiar. One morning, George even found them arranging small stones in elaborate patterns on the floor. Even the harmony of their songs, which was already quite good, was becoming a lot better. It was so good they sent chills down George's spine. But as winter gave way to spring, George noticed something else. The birds also had a wild appetite for pests. When he let them out to roam, they picked beetles and aphids from plants with what looked like surgical precision. Now George's flowers bloomed, and his beehives produced more honey than ever before. But none of that solved his growing unease. He even began to have strange dreams. He would dream of vast forests and even shimmering skies, and in those dreams he would hear distant echoes of the birds' songs. But he told no one of those dreams, so they would not get scared. But it was already too late. By spring the town was divided. Some were convinced the birds were sent from a higher force to bless them. They pointed out how well George's crops and animals were flourishing. His fields were also greener and more alive. But others, however, were convinced the birds were a bad omen. The tension bubbled until it exploded one evening when a group of townsfolk led by Hank staged a protest right outside George's farm. They carried signs with messages like "Protect our town" and "Say no to mutant birds." They even screamed for George, and their shouts echoed across many fields. George tried to ignore them for a while, but at last he stepped onto his porch, angry. "What do you want?" he yelled at them. "You know what we want. You have got to get rid of those things," Hank demanded, his eyes flicking nervously to the birds that had followed George. "They're not hurting anyone," George reminded him. "They have done nothing but help my farm and this community. For now, but what happens when they turn on you? You're playing with fire, George," Hank shot back. But before George could say any more, the birds gathered around him began to sing. This particular melody was so unlike anything any of them had heard before. It sounded so haunting and otherworldly. And to add to it, their shimmering feathers caught the sunlight. They looked and sounded like angels. The men froze, and George could see the fear grow in their eyes. At last, Hank whispered something to them, and they turned and left. George sighed as he watched them leave. From the resolve in their eyes, he knew they would be back. What do you think the men would do next? The weeks that followed were quite tense. George even noticed strangers lurking near his property, but each time he caught them, they looked away. Well, something finally did happen. Something that finally awoke the fear in George. What do you think happened? Well, one night, George woke up to the sound of shattering glass. He jumped up immediately and grabbed his gun. He tore through his back door and ran out. Then he froze in his tracks, in shock. His barn was on fire, and his animals were still in it. George quickly zapped out from his shock. He grabbed buckets and ran several times to his well until the fire was extinguished. George was breathing hard when he was done. He was so exhausted but not too exhausted to miss the message. Someone wanted the birds gone so badly. George felt fear and anger. These birds had hurt no one. All they had done was help save his farm. He was determined to fight for them, and even though he was afraid, he did just that. He visited the local store that morning and posted flyers saying that anyone who wanted the birds gone had to go through him first. His closest neighbors were very shocked that his barn had been burnt, and they, too, made their support for him and the birds very clear. They even offered to host the birds from time to time. But with that new twist came more strange happenings. A neighbor's garden suddenly began to thrive after the birds visited, and a swarm of locusts vanished overnight from another. The birds seemed to understand the balance of the land and were restoring what was broken. Soon other farms began to flourish too, and the birds began to win over even the most skeptical townsfolk. Their abilities went beyond pest control and pollination. They even seemed to understand human emotions and snuggled up to them when they noticed them looking wary. Maggie even swore they had helped her sickly granddaughter recover faster from a fever. Soon the whole farm community began to flourish. Many farms that were on the verge of closing up just like George's picked up again. Plants grew faster, and harvests were great. The birds won over the skeptics one by one. In fact, Hank was the last to come around, but he eventually did. How did it happen? One evening, as he inspected his fields, he found the birds pecking around. He was so filled with rage that he picked a stick and chased them away. Well, the next morning he noticed that the termites in his farms were gone. Hank was so shocked and speechless, but he was also very grateful. He was so grateful that he visited George and grudgingly admitted to him that the birds had some good in them. Soon the news about the birds had spread to other towns. Many news stations reached out to George, but he refused to grant any interviews. Finally, summer arrived, and with it, some scientists. They had heard the rumors and wanted to see for themselves. George hated scientists. He hated how they dissected animals like they weren't living things. But these ones spoke softly to him and only promised to observe the birds from a distance. George took them to where the birds walked the field. The scientists were shocked when they saw them. What do you think they would discover? The scientists told George that this species had been recorded to be extinct for centuries. But they also admitted that their abilities were unlike anything previously documented. They also told him that they had ecological benefits and that they were indeed very natural. Guess who felt guilty at hearing that report? Hank, of course. Now he had even more reason to apologize, and he did. Guess they're natural after all, he muttered to George. Can you accept an old dude's apology? He asked with outstretched hands. What would you have done if you were in George's shoes, especially when your barn had almost burnt to the ground? Well, George accepted his handshake. Hank turned out to be quite useful later when the scientists went back on their promise and tried to take the birds away. He threatened them off the community, and George was very grateful. Everyone else was happy too. With the birds, their fields flourished, pests died, and even the water in the nearby creek became clearer. George made so much money, enough to save his farm, and all the stray animals now had a permanent home. He even bought more fields and machinery and began selling to faraway towns. The community was boosted, and people traveled down to learn about the birds and their role in saving this farming community from closing down completely. Schools even brought students on field trips. Look how much George was rewarded for simply being kind. This story definitely reminds us that kindness will never go out of style. It also reminds us of the importance of standing up for what is right. But, most importantly, we should never forget that it is our responsibility to care for the world we live in and to nurture the living things under our care.